The cameras in the White House briefing room caught a moment meant to show unity, but what followed underscored division, not only among capitals, but across the lines of policy and diplomacy that now define the NATO era. Today, at a formal meeting in Washington, the United States President met with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. What began as a routine photo op and a walkthrough of domestic priorities, even a model of a proposed new White House ballroom, quickly pivoted toward matters that shape global security, weapons decisions for Ukraine, the possibility of a Chinese role in ending Europe's largest land war since World War II, and a sudden, sharp US threat at the heart of the hemisphere. When asked about the possibility of Tomahawk missile strikes, the president was explicit. The only way a Tomahawk is going to be shot is if we shot it, and we're not going to do that. That sentence, brief and blunt, is more than a denial of an immediate operational step. It is an expression of restraint, a public distancing from a direct US strike option, even as allies wrestle with whether, how, and when to arm Ukraine with longer-range capabilities. It is a line drawn in front of an audience that includes partners who want clarity, adversaries who test resolve, and publics that watch for both words and actions. Mark Rutte, representing NATO in this room, offered a complementary but different framing. He reminded listeners that arms decisions remain largely national and that NATO, as an alliance, does not take uniform positions on every specific system. He pointed to an evolving financial arrangement by which allies, including European partners and Canada, would pay for US-supplied weaponry to Ukraine, a pragmatic arrangement meant to bypass some of the political barriers in capitals. Rutte said that the president's earlier calls to build allied support had mattered, that the pledge to support Ukraine is close to the president's heart, and that the movement of billions in weaponry is underway. That mix, a US public denial of an immediate strike option coupled with allied pledges to resource Ukraine, encapsulates the patchwork strategy that has marked this conflict. Just a few feet away from the formal podium, the conversation shifted outward to Beijing. The president said he will press China's leader to apply pressure on Moscow and framed Xi Jinping as a potential interlocutor who can influence Vladimir Putin. He described his anticipated discussions with Xi as focused on ending the war, whether it's through oil or energy or anything else. He described Xi as a respected man and a very strong leader of a very big country who can exert a big influence on Putin's calculations. In those remarks is a clear strategic calculation that leverage over Russia can and should be broadened beyond military aid to economic and diplomatic levers, and that Beijing's choices on energy purchases and other forms of support are central to Moscow's capacity to sustain a long war. The president's language recognizes that energy markets remain among the most powerful weapons in this moment. When he referenced India, he said that country is already moving away from Russian purchases and that this transition will take time. With China, he signaled a different trajectory, one that he hopes to nudge rather than force. For Washington, that diplomatic approach is at once ambitious and risky. It asks a country that competes with the United States across trade, tech, and global influence to help resolve a war that has become a proxy of deeper strategic rivalry. It asks Beijing to put pressure on a long-standing military partner in Moscow. For China, the calculus will weigh economic relationships, global posture, and domestic political messages. For Europe and NATO, it raises familiar anxieties. Can Beijing be relied upon? Will this strategy yield bargaining chips that matter on the ground in Ukraine? Allies will be watching closely. Meanwhile, the president used the platform to take aim at a very different neighborhood. In a sudden turn, he announced the immediate halt of all payments to Colombia, words that landed like a thunderclap in a region already frayed by migration, drugs, and political discord. He accused Colombian President Gustavo Petro in blunt terms, calling him a thug and asserting that Colombia is making a lot of drugs, has cocaine factories, and is doing very poorly. He warned that Bogotá better watch it or will take very serious action against him and his country. Those remarks carry two kinds of consequence. In the short term, they immediately ratchet diplomatic tensions between Washington and Bogotá, two countries that have long been partners in counter-narcotics, migration management, and regional security. In the broader sweep, they hint at an administration prepared to use financial levers and public invective as instruments of statecraft in Latin America. Such a posture may satisfy domestic political constituencies that favour toughness, but it risks alienating regional partners whose cooperation is often essential in combating transnational crime and supporting migration solutions. Across all of these themes, weapons for Ukraine, an outreach to Xi, and punitive steps toward Colombia, one thread ties them together: the use of public statements not simply to inform but to shape behaviour. Public diplomacy, in this case, becomes the policy. Words are intended to signal capability, intent, and consequences, but words also constrain. Once spoken in such stark, categorical terms, they are difficult to walk back and can alter the room for negotiation. Consider the Tomahawk remark again. Allies who want longer-range weapons for Ukraine see practical operational benefits. They also see political costs. A public assurance from the US president that America will not fire Tomahawks narrows a military menu and places pressure on allies and proxies to fill gaps. Conversely, Rutte's description of allied funding arrangements suggests a parallel path. Even if America rules out firing certain systems directly, allied procured capabilities may still reach Ukrainian forces through other means. The net effect is a complex choreography: public restraint on one hand, private or allied action on the other. The president's comments about Xi and energy point to another battleground: markets. Energy imports and pricing sustain armies, feed economies, and fund states. If China were to scale back purchases of Russian oil, the revenue that underwrites Moscow's war machine would be reduced. But that shift would require Beijing to accept costs and disruptions in its own supply or to find alternative arrangements. It would, in short, require strategic trade-offs that touch the heart of China's domestic priorities. Regional responses are already shaping up. European capitals will interpret these American lines as invitations and limitations at once. Invitations to fund and supply Ukraine through collective mechanisms, limitations on what the US will do unilaterally. Asian capitals, particularly New Delhi and Beijing, will pass the tone in ways shaped by their own regional calculations. Latin American leaders will watch with alarm as Washington uses financial stoppages and pointed rhetoric. The United States, still a leading superpower, is today trying to push and pull many levers at once: military, economic, diplomatic, in many regions at once. That is a demanding choreography for any administration. The visual record from today's White House event adds texture to the remarks. Cameras showed not just the leaders at the podium, but the broader stage: senators, cabinet members, the public gallery of journalists, and even the model of the White House ballroom that briefly diverted the cameras. Those images serve as reminders. Domestic politics and spectacle are inseparable from foreign policy. A domestic political audience consumes every phrase, and those phrases echo abroad. For reporters and analysts, some practical questions follow. How will allies respond to the US refusal to fire certain weapons directly? Will funding mechanisms described by NATO leadership accelerate the flow of advanced systems to Ukraine? What leverage, concretely, can Beijing exert on Moscow, and will it choose to exercise it? And what are the immediate consequences for US-Colombia relations after this abrupt freeze on payments? On the matter of Tomahawks, the administration's public stance is likely to be interpreted by Russia as a rhetorical concession. Whether Moscow perceives it as a weakening of deterrence or as a narrowing of battlefield risks depends on how allies and partners fill the vacuum. If European and allied funding rapidly enables deliveries that materially change battlefield dynamics, then the practical effect of that US restraint may be limited. If not, the declaration could reshape tactical decision-making on the ground. On China, the president's strategy depends on diplomatic skill and timing. Pressing Xi to influence Putin is not a simple ask. It requires building a credible case that aligning with US interests in this instance would not irreparably harm China's own strategic aims. Diplomatic trust is in short supply between Washington and Beijing, yet remarkable diplomatic results are not unheard of when leaders see mutual interest. The question becomes, does Beijing see an advantage in pressuring Moscow now, or does it prefer to preserve strategic depth and influence over the long term? The Colombia announcement will be watched closely in Bogotá and across South America. Cuts in payments, whether they are aid, security assistance, or other financial flows, can have immediate operational impacts and long-term political effects. Latin American governments understand the leverage Washington holds, and many will consider how to respond both publicly and privately. Some may distance themselves from Bogotá, others may seek to preserve institutional channels despite the rhetoric. For viewers, the takeaway is straightforward but consequential. In a relatively short White House appearance, the president articulated a worldview that is transactional, direct, and public. He signaled restraint in one theatre, outreach in another, and punishment in a third. Each of those signals will shape diplomacy, alliance calculations, and crisis management in the days ahead. Analysts will now watch for follow-through, satellite and security assessments around Ukraine, diplomatic cables and quiet multilateral negotiations on arms financing, scheduled talks between Washington and Beijing, and the formal notifications or measures that accompany the announced halt to payments to Colombia. In short, the story is not limited to what was said on camera today. It extends into the private corridors where policy is operationalized. Finally, it is worth recording what those in the room said about the broader purpose of alliances. NATO, once again, was the backdrop for these conversations, a reminder that security commitments and the burden-sharing arrangements among allies will continue to define the limits of action. Rutte's insistence that it is up to individual nations to decide what they supply, and his note that allied funding schemes are being put in place, signals a Europe ready to finance the tools it deems necessary, even as it watches Washington's public posture. That kind of multilateral financing and logistical creativity reflects a hard lesson from this war. Military capabilities on the ground are vital, but strategic coherence among allies, the willingness to fund one another, and the ability to convert political will into material matter just as much. In Washington today, those calculations played out in an exchange that ranged from missile policy to energy diplomacy to the politics of Latin America, a compact lesson in how interconnected modern statecraft has become. This is an ongoing story. Leaders have spoken. Stakes remain high. The paths chosen in the coming days by Beijing, by European capitals, and by Bogotá as well as Washington will determine whether the remarks recorded today are prelude, pivot, or merely rhetoric. For now, the world watches and waits, measuring each public line against a much more complex private reality.
So on all of this, and today we will talk more on how we can really bring
our tremendous assets together. So we look forward to that. I think so. And we really should stop it.
And to your other question,
yes, please.
Sorry,
Mark Rutte, Secretary General of NATO, highly South Korea and Japan. In South Korea, I'll be at the Middle East +7. So we did 7 different wars from the problem with the Tomahawk that a lot of people don't know, it'll take a minimum of 6 months, usually a year, far out into the future.
Yes, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President. I saw Mr. President.
One of those boats heading away, you know, they're driving happily to destroy the lives of people, and we have to do it for Mr. President. We have to do it to save lives. The columns were removed, and it was a much different building. Then a story was added on of foreign leaders. You can see this. This is a plan. If it was a disaster, Brian's shaking his head. You know what I'm talking about. And so the ballroom, I think there'll be nothing like it. And it's being paid for 100%. And I didn't want that to happen. So prices are way down. Groceries are down. So the only way a Tomahawk is going to be shot is if we shot it. And we're not going to do that.
When it comes to Tomahawks or whatever system, it's up to individual nations to decide whatever they want to supply to Ukraine. NATO doesn't take a position, but I can assure you this. When the president called me in July and said we want to again send weapons into Ukraine, paid for by our allies, the Canadians and the Europeans, that was an important moment. And that is now taking place, and the ambassador, myself, we are working hard at this. Already a couple of $1 billion of weaponry into Ukraine from the US, paid for by allies. So I'm not going to comment on the Tomahawks, but when it comes to the US and all the support for Ukraine, it is there and it is close to the president's heart, and I know this.
I will. Well, I think I'll be talking to him about it. I think it's a little bit of a different talk. India, as you know, has told me they are stop. You know, it's a process. You can't just stop it. But by the end of the year, they'll be down to almost nothing. That's a big thing. There was almost 40% of the oil. India, they've been great. Spoke to Prime Minister Modi yesterday. They've been absolutely great. China's a little bit different, you know, they're a little bit different relationship they have with Russia. It was never good, but because of Biden, and than they would normally be. I think I'll probably be talking about it. What I'll really be talking to him about is how do we end the war with Russia and Ukraine, whether it's through oil or energy or anything else. And I think he's going to be very receptive. He would now like to. I'm not sure that he did at the beginning. He would now like to see that war end.
Mr. President.
I do. I think he can have a big influence on Putin. I think he can have a big influence on a lot of people. Look, he's a respected man. He's a very strong leader of a very big country. Yeah, I think he can have a big influence. And we will certainly be talking about Russia, Ukraine.
Mr. President.
Is making a lot of drugs. We've just, as of today, stopped all payments going to Colombia, the country Colombia. Also, the school Colombia. No, we settled. We made a settlement with him. But no, he's a thug, and he's a bad guy, and he's hurt his country very badly. They're doing very poorly, Colombia. They make cocaine. They have cocaine factories. They grow all sorts of crap that's drugs, bad drugs coming into the United States, goes generally through Mexico. And he better watch it or we'll take very serious action against him and his country. His country is what he has led.